I'm Rebecca Whitlock, and I teach humanities at Pasco-Hernando State College, Porter campus. And I'm here today to talk about heavy metal music. And who better to talk about heavy metal music with than librarians?
I'm Andrew Beeman Cavallaro. I'm the library director over at the Porter campus.
And my name's Janet Schock. I'm a librarian also at the Porter campus.
What we're doing here today is just providing a brief introduction into the academic study of heavy metal. And so to start with that, we'll just give a real brief history lesson of heavy metal. Andrew, where did heavy metal originate?
It's funny. I mean, a lot of people don't think about it a lot, but I mean, heavy metal aspects come back through like classical music and operatic material, and then it kind of got broken down into smaller ensembles when you have like swing and jazz, and then that kind of broke down into other smaller regional classifications when you ended with like country and blues and ragtime and gospel and Motown, and you have this like a lot of musicians that you wouldn't necessarily associate with heavy metal, but as far as chords and riffs and soul music and sort of that sort of operatic expressionist voice. I mean, you've got folks like Robert Johnson and Otis Redding and Sam and Dave and Chuck Berry starting out with kind of earlier rock and roll and Muddy Waters with blues, and then like those really belting vocal performances. You've got folks like Aretha Franklin and Bessie Smith, Ella Fitzgerald, Nina Simone, and then that gets kind of taken and oftentimes got picked up over in England. So you ended up with like the Beatles getting inspired by Buddy Holly, going into like Cream and Led Zeppelin, and then like folks like Black Sabbath and Deep Purple are using like the chords and the sort of like band, Devil's Triad tones that have been banned by the church for years. And Tony Iommi and Black Sabbath brought that out. Sort of like the performance-based theatrical stuff with more like, Kiss and Alice Cooper, and the blues stuff that kind of comes out of like Thin Lizzy and Aerosmith, and the harder stuff with like Judas Priest and like in Motorhead. And then you got like new wave stuff with like Iron Maiden and Saxon that brings out that sort of larger, more operatic sound. And then you got like the glam stuff that comes down from like, Bon Jovi and Motley Crue. And like as an antithesis to that, you've got like the big four with heavy metal, and you've got Metallica and Megadeth and Slayer and Anthrax, and like the punk genres that come out of that. Black Flag and a lot of the poetry that was in Black Flag is kind of like an homage back to the Doors with Morrison. And then new metal, where you start having like drum machines kind of coming in and getting interacted with heavy metal like that, and then like progressive metal. So you've got like really asymmetric time beats, and for as far as percussion goes, really complicated percussion with folks like Dream Theater with Tool. And then really you've got even like funk metal. So you've got folks like Suicidal Tendencies, and Robert Trujillo, who's the current bassist for Metallica, was a very funk-based kind of heavy metal guy in Suicidal Tendencies. And then that kind of brings you into like death metal, which was really big in Tampa, and just kind of going back on Tool. But like the fact that it's such a global phenomenon in heavy metal, really, I got to see Melt Banana open for Tool, and Melt Banana is a Japanese like heavy metal band fronted by a very, very, very tiny yet very vocally prominent lady. So it's this is incredible, fortunately now more expanding style out from the very, we're going to steal from these other genres and use them, and it's going to be very male and very Caucasian, which has elements in it as well, good and bad. And but that's kind of like, if you like heavy metal, you probably like classical, and you probably like jazz, and you probably like soul. So yeah, that's kind of like a little crash course kind of movement through it.
Yes, there's so much diversity in heavy metal music, and that's one of the things that I really noticed as I was preparing for today's discussion. I was watching some documentaries by an anthropologist named Sam Dunn, and not only is he a huge heavy metal fan, but he studies heavy metal as an anthropologist, and he has two really good documentaries. One is A Headbanger's Journey, another one is a series called Metal Evolution. Great resources. But one of the big takeaways was I was noticing, yes, there's so much diversity, and every subgenre of heavy metal thinks that they are the only real one. Like it's everyone else is a poser, but I'm the real heavy metal. And I just thought that was really funny. Like he was describing a situation in the 80s in New York City where, you know, there was this huge rivalry between the thrashers and the hardcore metal. And they would just get into these brawls and pummel each other. And from an outsider's perspective, they look like they have so much in common. And I just found that really interesting, how humans tend to do that. We have this tribal way of forming communities, finding people that are like-minded, that have similar interests, and we feel comfortable in those communities and we feel welcomed. And that feels really good, and that's important. But at the same time, it's this double-edged sword, because everyone who's not in that community suddenly becomes the other. They become an outsider, and it creates fighting. Janet, I know you've done some research on this kind of tribalism in heavy metal music. And by the way, it's not just heavy metal music. Tribalism exists throughout human culture. But I'm curious what kinds of observations you've made.
Well, one of the things that I kind of find interesting is that oftentimes you have these different subgenres of heavy metal that become attached to different political, religious, or even racial ideologies. So for instance, I'm reading right now about how a lot of hate groups, like white power nationalist groups, have been using different forms of heavy metal and punk music to communicate their ideology, to sometimes explicitly to gather new recruits, but other times as just a way to express their political ideology. And I think heavy metal is like many other art forms that have been used, some say abused, some say it's just part of, wrapped up in these different messages, different political ideologies, and sometimes with even with religious ideologies too. Like you have a lot of like that's a whole other discussion there. And so it's kind of it's for me, it's an interesting lens by which to look at these other sociological phenomena in
It's
the
just
world.
one of many examples of the ways that humans connect with each other and the way that we interact with each other. And there, you can study, just like Jane Goodall studied, primates in the wild. You can study headbangers in the wild, and you can learn something about human culture that way. And so, from my perspective as a woman, I can kind of use my experience with heavy metal to kind of understand a little bit about what other people might be experiencing as outsiders on the outside of heavy metal. I think that women have always been a part of heavy metal from the beginning, but I think in the beginning they played more of a background role. You have women like Sharon Osbourne managing the band from the back. You have costume designers like Flor Thameyer creating the looks that became so emblematic of the hair bands in the 80s. And a lot of times you have young women like me, like when I was in college, standing on the side of a pit holding my boyfriend's jacket. So it's like we wanted to be part of it. We were attracted to the music, we were attracted to the energy, but we didn't really feel like we had a place there. And that has definitely changed. If you look at the family tree that anthropologist Sam Dunn created for heavy metal music, it's really interesting to kind of look at the evolution of heavy metal and look at some of the grandfathers of heavy metal like Jimi Hendrix and Led Zeppelin. But I would argue that there are also, grandmothers of heavy metal as well. Then I find it interesting that they were not included on that list in the first place. So you have women like Joan Jett, Hart, Janis Joplin, the whole Riot Grrrl movement of the 90s that was very influential on the grunge scene. So you've got Kathleen Hanna, the front singer of Bikini Kill, and she's a very prominent member of the third wave feminist movement that happened in the 90s. And one of the things that I think was really incredible about what Bikini Kill was doing was they were literally making a place for women in that scene. She would, at her concert, she would say, okay, women to the front, girls to the front. The men cannot, we want the men to be here, but we don't want them to dominate the space to the extent that the women are pushed out physically. And, I think that really was a turning point. I think a lot of young women saw singers like Kathleen Hanna and L7 and Sonic Youth and, Kim Deal and these women who were having a voice in heavy metal. And so now you see contemporary heavy metal has a lot more of a female presence. You see women making the music, you see women singing. You have bands like Walls of Jericho where the female singer has a really intense heavy metal growly voice, and you might not even realize that she was a woman if you didn't see her picture. On the other side, you have bands like OTEP where the female voice is more melodic and feminine sounding, and it creates this really interesting contrast to the heavy metal sound. There are so many different varieties of heavy metal. Everyone seems to have their own opinion on what constitutes heavy metal. What is the essence of heavy metal? I mean,
chords, power chords are a huge kind of thing. The percussion and the bass are usually a sort of down forward driving element of it. Even if it's complex, there's usually some sort of forward, feet on the floor moving forward element of it. And then an attitude about being part of a group while not wanting to fit at the same time. Is this weird juxtaposition between, I want to be an individual, you don't understand me, I'm rebelling against this, I want to be with these group of people that are doing the same thing.
What do you think, Janet? How would you define heavy metal?
Well, the first thing that I thought of, well, obviously it's music, and Andrew, you described those musical elements very well. But it's about an image and about an attitude. And a word that kept coming up in a lot of research I looked into was this idea of transgression, which I think is a sociological concept, but it's this idea that there's a boundary and we're going to cross it, and we're just going to cross it, not even just for the sake of crossing it sometimes. So anything that's taboo, we're gonna break that. And I think that's what kind of unites all of these different subgenres to some aspect. So that could be, maybe men. Okay, if it's wrong to dress up as as a woman, we're not only gonna dress up like women, we're gonna be like the most like fabulous, crazy looking women, and that's gonna be how we cross the line.
So what is the value of studying heavy metal as from a librarian's perspective? What is the value in studying this culture, and how does one go about studying it?
Whether you want to do research on heavy metal or rap music or reality TV or wrestling or whatever, all of these are different forms of expression of human culture, and because of that makes them valuable. One, for if you're a historian, you might be looking at its value for the historical record. If you're a psychologist, you might be wondering, okay, why does this person, why do they feel the need to put on makeup on their face and dress in platform boots? And so you can use heavy metal as a lens to explore those questions. I'm really interested in the death metal and Tampa Bay topic. I'm not super crazy about death metal as a fan, but that connection with Tampa is very interesting to me as a historian. So that's something that I'm very that's something I want to dig into, and that tells us a little bit about not only the immediate subject, but also what does this say about the Tampa Bay area? What does this say about this culture of the early 90s? As far as resources, you have to get a little bit creative, because heavy metal and pop culture studies in general are there's such a interdisciplinary field that you might not have a single point to go to, but you have lots of points to go to.
I was really amazed when I saw how much academic material there is about heavy metal. There's MIT recently did a workshop called Heavy Metal 101 earlier this year. There's a scholarly journal devoted strictly to heavy metal studies.
And this is where I'll turn to the shameless plug for your librarians. This is what we're here for. About it, but it's perfectly valid and a wonderful way to get excited about a topic and grow your scholarly capabilities.
Absolutely. And it reminds me of, the work of Roland Barthes, where he talks about the value of looking at cultural texts. So we're not just looking at written language, but we're looking at really anything. I mean, you can choose anything and you can read it like a text, and you can use it to help you understand the culture in which that text emerged. And I think there's a lot of value in learning about any culture. This is something that I've done in my class with hip hop music, actually, and now I'm excited to add in some information about heavy metal music as well. But I think there's so much that you can learn about your culture and yourself by being mindful of what kind of art forms you're participating in, and just really asking yourself, well, what does this mean about myself, and who am I including, who am I excluding, and do I intend to exclude them? Am I making my culture inhospitable to people that are outside of my comfort zone? And is that really what I want to do? Well, this has been an incredibly interesting conversation. I really hope that this is just the beginning, because there's so much more to talk about related to heavy metal studies. But I just can't thank you enough for going on this little journey with me and having this conversation. Thank you so much.
Thanks so much.
Thank you.